All right, happy Wednesday, everybody. This is the July Open Forum. I'm Dr. Hunter Peterson, Clinic Director at Coeur d'Alene Healing and Arts, and this is a colleague and collaborator at Coeur d'Alene Healing and Arts, Dr. David Campbell, who is a licensed acupuncturist and doctor of Chinese medicine. So good to have you back. We last spoke together was about a year ago. So I'm excited to join in a really interesting conversation with David today. And as you all know from the title, if you tuned in, thank you for those who are watching live. And obviously this recording will be posted to our website. We're going to be talking about the placebo effect today. And so if you have questions, feel free to put it in the meeting chat. And we'll circle back to it maybe during our conversation, but everyone stay muted, that would be great. And if you additionally have above and beyond questions that don't relate to the placebo effect, the topic we decided to discuss today, feel free to also put those in the chat. It's open forum. The idea is that we're here to, open up to any health related topics and questions you have. So without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to Dr. David to kind of get us kicked off on this topic, and we'll go from there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say definitely when I was in school, the placebo effect was something I kept coming back to in thinking. One reason is just how research is composed. There's this idea that the highest form of research, well, they say is meta-analysis, but meta-analysis is usually made of placebo-controlled double-blind study, right? So that's what they consider the gold standard of clinical research in general. So, but it's hard and it's very difficult to apply that to holistic medicine. And the reason is because you're trying to reduce the treatment down to a single variable for a single disease. And the placebo is just there to offer as, oh, we're not going to give you anything, but we want to make sure you don't know that. So it's an inert placebo. That's often the term used. And that's okay as long as your treatment is a singular, usually chemical. Ironically, there has been placebo-controlled surgical studies, and the outcomes were kind of interesting because they didn't find that much difference in outcome. But sham surgery has now been labeled as unethical, so they don't do those anymore. But it made me wonder about well, we hear a lot about the placebo effect, and it's a significant enough effect that it is actually quite difficult to overcome. I think we were talking before, you mentioned sometimes it's as high as 30% improvement, or 30% of people will have improvement in the placebo group. So that's, that's pretty significant. So to me, it makes me wonder, well, one, what is the placebo effect? And are we labeling it correctly? And how, if there is such a thing, then why aren't we looking into how to utilize it better? And I think that's where in holistic medicine, while we're coming at health problems from all these different perspectives, lifestyle, nutrition, as well as, possibly herbs or other natural supplements, and other modalities, we sometimes talk about doctor-patient relationship and building rapport, because I believe that's a big part of whether people heal or not, and why it's a big part is for the same reason why the placebo effect is a big part of healing. It's actually your own innate ability to heal, and accessing that is important. So what I found out recently that kind of made me laugh is placebo. It's a strange word. Well, it turns out it's a Latin word, and it's a description of a kind of prayer in its original usage, and sometimes was used as a term when praying for the sick. Well, it turns out there's actually been several studies showing that prayer for the sick does actually improve their outcomes. So it kind of comes full circle almost where, I think still in the mainstream, we get this idea that placebo's inert, the effect is, something we should marginalize. But more and more people, I think, are coming around to this idea of well, wait a minute, what is healing? what actually causes people to heal, and how much of it is within, our, I'll say, for lack of a better term, our mental state or our intention, and what I come to a lot with this is a feeling of purpose or a feeling of meaning in life. There's people need something, an aim that motivates them, because ultimately health is a resource for living a meaningful life. If you don't have a purpose, you don't have, people you love and community, family, it becomes harder and harder to heal the less of motivation you have. And I think that's also a testament to what the placebo effect actually is. Yeah, and I do feel like our jobs, a lot of it is initiating that self-healing process, partly providing people what they need, but partly figuring out what will actually motivate the individual to heal.
Mhm. Yeah, you just packed a lot in there, so I want to kind of tease that apart and like have us break out a few of those sharings over the course of our dialogue. So you started with this conversation about, in the medical paradigm we currently have, Western medicine and medical research, that we're really framing, where most of us end up hearing the term placebo effect is in the framework deployed by Western medical research. And
generally drug studies.
Drug studies, right? And so really like to elaborate that further, I just think, so that all the audience can orient this conversation. We're looking at, we've mostly heard this term, I would say, in an almost like condescending, disempowered framework, to say the placebo effect is, you didn't get the physical medicine that's designed to help heal you and make you better if you're in the placebo group. And so that idea that, like David said, it's an inert physical substance that's given, or a physical treatment, and that it's kind of almost like you're not getting the helpful thing. But the interesting thing is, in Western medicine, in these double-blinded trials, they make you think you're getting the thing. In other words, they give you a pill that looks like the pill that actually has the drug in it. And then they compare how well the drug works on the symptoms you're measuring versus how well the empty pill that looks like the drug worked. And to spell out what Dr. David was saying is that what most research finds is almost always, if a person gets the pill without any of the active ingredient, most of the time they get better. And even on averages, sometimes they, the average improvement is like over 30% of getting the placebo pill, which means that, and this is pretty regular, like almost always the placebo group improves. So really, in Western medicine, their research model, to make a drug like pass muster and have it be worth taking into like the market to give to patients, the effect of the drug needs to exceed the benefit that the placebo alone is providing. So like, for example, if you have a drug that works on heartburn and it improves, heartburn symptoms by 30%, but the placebo group who took the pill that didn't have anything in it improved by 25%, so almost the same, they're going to say, well, that drug's not effective. And all of the focus in the research world is about the drugs and how we can make these drugs to these physical substances to help with health. And what David and I are laughing about is that, well, if you get over and over and over again these placebo, meaning no active ingredients in the physical substance given, and yet people are getting better, and on average, again, like often quite a bit better in some of these studies, and almost all of them, they're getting somewhat better. It's like, why aren't we taking all of the tools at our disposal and understanding them to the highest degree and deploying them in our healthcare, approach with people? And so if I were to extend that metaphor, my way of thinking is, well, if I was the patient sitting there and had horrible heartburn and I really wanted to get better, and the doctor hands me this pill and says, this is going to make your symptoms better, trust me, in the therapeutic, the doctor's the expert, the patient's laying their trust in the doctor's hands and saying, you have something that will heal me, what's happening there, if it's the blank, if it's the placebo, is there is a really powerful process internally that is not material. Clearly, it's not the pill going on in what drives our health and our vitality, that our belief that taking the pill will help us is transforming and precipitating healing. Am I just, am that flushing it out, is that kind of accurate to how you
Yeah,
kind of
definitely.
framing it? And so that's really, like, I think the framework of this discussion today is, first of all, we should not be labeling placebo as this like dirty term that is like this you know, annoying, medical terminology that needs to be overcome to get a drug to the market. But we should be really saying this is a pretty powerful force. We have this really pretty like rigorous, methodological way of doing research. And it's showing that over and over and over again, this effect of the belief of the mind that something is helping someone is really potent in health. And let's understand that more. Let's talk about that, and let's share to our patients or our community why that is so valid, and not to be dismissed, and not to be seen as like, second fiddle to a big, powerful, big pharma drug. Yeah, so that's kind of, where we're headed here. And I know, David, when we were prepping for this talk, you shared about some of the authors who have started to talk about this in like some really well-written books. And I was curious if you wanted to kind of bring in some of those concepts.
Yeah, there's a few different books. The one that's most obvious is there's a book called You Are the Placebo by Joe Dispenza. And he gets into this topic. He's big in the natural healing world and talks a lot about how to use meditation, how to use intention to heal yourself. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, I think his story was that he was in a bike accident where he broke tons of bones in his body, really bad accident. And he was all, basically in a full body cast for a few months. And he just sat there and he would look up images of anatomy online, and then he would use that as a framework to meditate on those parts of his body, and try to envision them having that healthy anatomy that he was investigating. And he found that he healed so well, he basically got labeled a medical miracle. No one understood how he could have recovered from those kinds of injuries the way that he did. And so that's kind of been his big push. He does a lot of lecturing, and I'm sure he's written more than one book, but yeah, I think it, and I think his exercises have helped a lot of people because it helps them have a focus for their mind to orient themselves toward health, for whatever problem they're facing. And it's amazing how well the body responds to our mind and our consciousness. There's a term, psychoneuroimmunology, where the immune system really responds to our state of mind. And this is why whenever I see autoimmune conditions, or say a significant number of allergies or food sensitivities, I ask sometimes about, if there was a traumatic experience or a just very stressful period of life that brought some of these things on, because often the immune system getting dysregulated in that way is very much tied to severe stress, whether that's a specific trauma or just a very taxing time in life.
And we should frame that mental, emotional stress, not
Right,
physical stress.
right, yeah. So and that's just one system of the body. I think all the systems of the body respond. I mean, just cortisol alone can cause some really significant damage if it's left unchecked for long periods of time. But yeah, there's, and then conversely, and I would think, I don't know if Joe Dispenza has talked about this specifically, but I know people who will literally meditate on visualizing their immune system, their white blood cells actually attacking a disease, and it seems to help them heal faster. So, again, it's both state of mind, but it's also how we use our intention and our mental abilities, because we can actually direct it. It's not simply because if you're going through stress that, oh, you're just going to have all these health problems. There are ways also, and I think for a lot of people, prayer and going to church these actually are really powerful ways of resetting the mental state and reorienting around what you actually value. And values are really important to motivating the body back toward coherence. There's terms in Chinese medicine, one of the ways we think about what healing is they talk about xie qi and zheng qi. Xie, some people translate it as evil. That's not a very good literal translation. It really means out of sync or out of alignment. And so I really think of it as in terms, like we could call that decoherent or discordant if we want to use a musical metaphor, versus zheng qi is in alignment, or we can think of in sync or in harmony. And so the idea is, because this is really how I think the energetic systems of the body work, is they're either in concert or in coherence, or they're decoherent or in discord. And so you may not pick it up right away when things come out of sync, but over time that will lead to slow, and sometimes faster, but usually slower degeneration of whatever system or body part is out of sync. And that can be as simple as restricted blood flow on a very physical level, but it can also be about a stored emotion. It can be about a certain experience or something, even an old injury that has a certain charge to it that the person feels, is a current insult or doesn't allow them to live the way they want to, something like that, where it can build up a charge so it can have both a physical and energetic component. But yeah, and in Chinese medicine, we also look at the emotions as each emotion has a particular organ that it tends to affect more. And so there's that aspect of it as well. But yeah, I think coherence is a really good way to think about health. And then therefore anything we do to foster coherence, whether prayer or meditation, that's going to bring health to the body, because it's going to bring it into a greater state of coherence and integrity with itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess when it boils down to it, really, like, we need to work with, and I'm going to use the term the mind, because I do want to get away from a very, like, I guess I'll say form-based concept like brain. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to actually be specific in using that word and explain why I'm being specific, because our mind is an incredibly complex, infinitely complex. We couldn't even begin to have a conversation if we talk for 20 hours, 24 hours straight about, what the mind is and what it's capable of, particularly the human mind, let alone all sentient beings. But this idea, and the reason I don't say the brain is because to me, the mind encompasses the emotional body, or the emotional aspect of our being, encompasses the mental aspect of our being, encompass the spirit soul aspect of our being. I think the mind, is in deep engagement with those profoundly powerful forces of our existence. And, when we talk about healthcare and doctors, most people are walking up to the doctor to be receiving care with a very physical expression of dissonance or decoherence. Mm-hmm. Like they're like this, if we're defining health as like a coherence or lack thereof, then they're having a lack or a degenerative, coherence in their physical body. And they're basically saying, well, okay, I want help with this physical strain. And our medical system has said, well, we have these physical substances that will help you with that. And that's kind of like the very reductionistic, simplified model. And basically what Dr. David and I are saying is, well, look, the placebo effect is this example where there is a way more powerful force that the mind exerts on health. And he's explained a lot of very specific examples of, visualization, meditation, prayer, or spiritual practice. I want to highlight a really big one, which is the human interconnectedness of the relational, you touched on it, but the relational power of trust, and especially in the quote unquote therapeutic relationship where healing is at the center of attention in the relationship. And I think that that's, one of the places I want to like dig in here in this, discussion is when we're essentially saying in all healing, the mind has this profoundly central role to play. We can see it in the placebo effect. When we've, essentially taken all the other variables out, we see it has this huge effect, over and over and over again. So what does that look like? What are the different examples of how we can capture that and engage with that for healing? But also, I mean, conversely, I think for decoherence and degeneration and harm. And so like the term that I use a lot in my practice is I tell people I've only seen this more and more and more as I've gone through my practice, is the amount of chronic stress related illness or decoherence is overwhelmingly the largest driver of physical disease expression, in my opinion. So again, we're really coming back to hold this mind concept in its influence on health in really high regard. And then we're saying full force that the mind's exertional influence on the physical body is arguably, in our modern world, in America, in this moment in time, I believe, the biggest driver of physical pattern expression of disease and, compromise. And I can very much raise my hand and say in my personal life, I'm really dedicated a lot of my physical habits and practices, but my stress of the mind is probably the one I know so clearly to be the most straining and compromising to my vitality and health. So I'll say this very personally too, is not as if I'm above it, because I'm sure not. So I want to really drive home, because, and maybe I know Dr. David, you probably get a little more openness in your practice, and I probably get more openness than most conventional medical practices, but people come into medical visits very hung up with this idea that, your physical body is what's out of balance, strictly, and it's from physical planes that imbalance has risen. I believe our medical system has relentlessly driven home that narrative about physical plane imbalance, decoherence, that it is originating from a physical cause. And, even when we look at the scientific method of how we're describing clinical trials, it's literally saying, when we are working on what's going to help people with their health, we're going to screen out the power of the mind body, the mind connection to health, and we're going to call it the placebo effect. And again, I'm loving getting to have this conversation because I'm so passionate that is a really, really, really wrong turn we have made relatively recently in the healing arts. I'll just call them, right? Healing arts, meaning, restoring, bringing health to our beings. And this is where I want to tap the history a little bit. And I was a history major in college, and I know David loves history too. So to nerd out a bit, if you look at the history of healing, then up until probably a couple hundred years ago, we'll say, almost all healing was infused with a spiritual orientation to the designated healer, meaning the person helping another with healing, doing work to precipitate healing. In other words, that, we can call it traditional medicine, but you see these ideas of elders, healers, shamans, and again, many terms could be applied. But the idea is that all of the healing rituals, whether or not there was a physical medicine given, often there was a physical substance given, but always, basically, for the history of human healing that we have recordings of for thousands of years, there was a spiritual orientation that had everything to do with the mind. and this might have been like a spiritual, incantation, a prayer, um, some form of offering up maybe to a higher power or to something greater than ourselves, the intent, and you use that word intention, that intention toward healing. And so David has already shared about it around the importance of it in medicine, but I want to share the historical precedence of it. And I think when humans do something for a few thousand years, they don't just keep doing it because it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right? We do it because it works. And then that leads us up to, well, if for so long we've embraced this interactive, this fusion of physical substance medicine that has an action on the body, on the physical, physical medicine for physical ailments, but then, spiritual mind medicines for physical ailments, always being fused together and deployed alongside each other. Why would we move away from that? What made us decide to move away from that? And I always ask that question too, as a studier of history, and particularly medicine, because I'm in a very peripheral medical field, they would call it, and I'm outside of the standard of care and the mainline belief model. And so then Dr. David and I were prepping for this talk and chatting that you go back to an interesting era, particularly in American medical history, which, the word Flexner report is kind of a pretty watershed moment, but it's briefly explained. It's a time where essentially the Industrial Revolution had just happened in the later 1800s, and oil and steel and these massive, essentially industries had amassed immense wealth and arguably held, de facto all of the power in our country, in essentially puppet string pulled our government to basically deploy all of the ways to regulate our society. And, the petrochemical industry, as maybe you all know or don't know, is the essentially foundation of the pharmaceuticals we utilize.
Yep.
And I don't know if you want to share a little more about, kind of that evolution, but kind of getting at this idea when we talk about parsing off the mind spirit, work of healing.
Yep.
And how that's come about, like what the kind of nefarious undertones, I would call them, are to where we've gotten to where we've got to, and why this has been disassociated, why placebo has become this kind of dirty, ugly term that they're using to cast this mind healing work into.
Well, I was just thinking, because I believe it was in the year 1900 that the Rockefellers basically created the AMA, the American Medical Association, which then shut down, I believe, about 2/3 of the medical schools in the United States.
Along with the Flexner report and the subsequent government action. By the way, Rockefeller funded the Flexner report, which is a physician who said, oh, all these other healing arts, homeopathy, herbal medicine, all, aren't
anything
legit.
Natural, basically.
Yeah, anything natural you can't use.
And I mean, that caused a huge problem in this country, because then there was a real loss of medical expertise and providers because they shut so many schools down. But there was a huge concerted effort to put all of the money and legitimacy into basically pharmaceutical-based medicine, and pharmaceuticals mostly being molecules that can be synthesized from petrochemicals, i.e. oil and gas. So because the Rockefellers had made their money in oil and gas. So that's the money side of it. I will also say, I believe 1900 was the same year that Freud published one of his seminal works, maybe his first, I can't remember exactly, but he intended it to create the field of psychology. And in a way it did. And what I always think is interesting about Freud is he's very much first and foremost a materialist in his worldview. And it was the first time the psyche had been looked at as a material phenomenon and not a spiritual phenomenon. So the 20th century is sort of this turn where anything religious or spiritual got marginalized as unscientific. arguably that process had begun with, so the scientific method was born of a philosophy called naturalism, and naturalism explicitly says that natural phenomena are physical, quantifiable, and studyable, and anything basically non-physical is superstition and, doesn't really exist or can't be studied. Ironically, there have been plenty of great scientists who figured out ways to study non-physical phenomena, and there's a whole treasure trove of really interesting science in that field. Dean Radin is one of my favorite. He's a PhD who's written several books on what the term that's generally used is psi, which is spelled PSI, phenomena. A lot of people would call them psychic phenomena. But he's done extremely well-controlled laboratory experiments to prove that there's such a thing as remote viewing, as precognition or presentiment, meaning feeling something ahead of time. And just a whole host of other phenomena would be difficult to go through exactly. He's written, like I said, many books. I highly recommend his books if you're interested in the topic, because he's spent about 40 years doing this, and he has been extremely rigorous because he wants his data to be foolproof. So that's all to say that that's been going on in the 20th century as well, while the mass of money and mainstream attention is on this hyper materialistic paradigm. There's been an undercurrent that survived regardless, even without much funding or attention. And I think it's actually coming into its own in the 21st century. I think we're seeing a bit of a paradigm shift as more and more people question the frameworks that have been imposed upon us about what reality actually is. So a lot of people say like, oh, there's a joke actually that in a lot of physics departments, there's the term "it's just." So like if you see a phenomenon that looks like an anomaly, it's just these smaller things interacting, right? So and what people always say is like, well, we're looking for the building blocks of physical reality, right? That's how most people think about physics. We're looking for the smallest building block. Well, what if reality is not built? What if it grows? And what if, the integrity of a whole system, a whole complex system, like an organism, is as important as the pieces that make it up. Meaning the whole exerts, because if you cut off my arm no longer has much intention. It's not going to be able to perform much. But my arm being a part of my body, I can use my hands to a lot of different things, and it's based on my intention and my abilities that I've trained myself to do. And so the question then becomes like, well, is it just some building blocks that assembled together and have some synapses and that's why it just happens? Or is there something else, something, a spirit, a soul, a mind that draws in information and puts out into the world through its intentions an action that's not merely the sum of the parts? Even if you look at the cells, or you look at the molecules, you look at this atoms, do you think a pile of molecules or atoms is going to perform very well if it has no integrity, if it has no coherence? It's not going to do anything. So there's a science, they call it emergence in complexity theory, where they talk about that once a certain level of complexity develops, a new ability emerges. It actually does have top-down effects. So we have the bottom up of the building block, but we have the top down of the emergent qualities. I would say traditionally, again, that's looked at as the soul that inhabits the body, right? We can call it a mind. I could split hairs and get into like, well, what is actually what? There's different esoteric traditions of how we think about these things. Like, for instance, in Western esotericism, there's a difference between the etheric and the astral. And a lot of people are like, well, it sounds like the same thing, because in modern times, we don't really talk about these subjects. But the etheric is what animates the body. So it's more like the metabolic energy and the electrical energy moving through the body that keeps it alive. The astral is more like what we think of as a soul or a mind. It's the thing that's actually exerting intention. So those two are related, they interact quite a lot, but they're not the same thing. So that's why I would say acupuncture is premised on working with kind of the etheric level, that energetic level of the body. We can even, test on the skin and we find, oh, it's more conductive on the acupuncture channel. And at the point, the acupoint, we actually find it's even more conductive there. So there's an actual electrical phenomenon going on. And that's what I would say was meant by the etheric level in older times, say in Western history. But now we call that electromagnetic. Fine. I'm fine with calling it electromagnetic, but there's still then a principle of organization. And that's a little bit beyond just the electromagnetic. So that's what people used to mean by astral. And like I said, we can call it whatever we want, but we have to acknowledge then there is this top-down effect. And that's where the placebo is really coming from. And then there's interesting technologies in the early 20th century, like Royal Rife created the Rife machine. And there's still, if you want to go down a deep rabbit hole on the internet, you can look up Royal Rife.
Yeah.
But he was eventually, shunned by the FDA and all of that. But he was creating machines that were giving off EMFs or radio waves. Different people argue about what actually it was doing, but it had a plasma chamber. It was producing electromagnetic frequencies. And he was claiming to have all these miraculous healing effects on a lot of different people. And that's one pathway that technology could have gone. But it was more suppressed because, again, it was harder. If you look at why drugs were the choice, it's like, well, you can patent a novel molecule. That means you can make a lot of money off of it. I mean, that ultimately, it's pretty bleak in that way. And the placebo effect, the mental healing effect, is literally the most unpatentable thing there is.
Yeah.
You heal yourself. Now, that doesn't mean you don't need help. We all need help with that at times. We all need good friends, good family, and providers that can help realign us and remove obstacles. Because that's the other thing. We can want something as much as and focus on it, have all the intention, but there's also work to get there. There's hurdles, and sometimes we need help from certain people to get over those hurdles. So it's not that all of medicine's a sham. It's that placebo effect is actually core to your healing. That doesn't mean it's the only thing you need.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like, kind of, you again went through some really cool topics, and I think we could have hour chats about multiple of them, but I want to follow right off that last thing you said and kind of move into this discussion about, really that essentially what we're arguing today, one of the most powerful things in health and healing is, first of all, to acknowledge that it is the patient or the person who does the healing, and that the provider themselves isn't really responsible for that. And we're really giving a lot of credit to this astral, mind-driven process in the healing, and saying it has a really, really big role to play. And so a person's desire to heal in and of itself is profound. I've actually had patients come into my office, and from the really nuanced, thoughtful conversation, we've discerned that it literally said it matter-of-factly out loud, I don't want this to get better. I don't want this to change. And then I say, okay, well, good. That was a valuable use of our time to come to that clarity about this. And so if you don't want this to change, then I don't think like us getting together further is going to have meaning, because, you're getting what you want. And that again, that top-down approach there is just so powerful, so hard to overcome. And I think there's, again, we've alluded to that in different ways of bringing things into coherence. And so I really want to get at this, like put my thumb on what I think is really key about this concept, which is that, first of all, in medicine, I think egotistically, we take a lot more ownership of the healing process in our medical systems and as providers than we should be. And all of these complexities that we're trying to illuminate, Dr. David and I today, hopefully are like putting some, context on that statement, that it's like, Yeah, it's not so much about your intellectual knowledge of, drug medicines and physiology and what labs mean what and all this stuff. I mean, of course, it has its role.
Mhm.
And we're not invalidating the existence of medical professionals and experts. But I think what we're also really saying is that if singularly this top-down belief, power of intention is so important, then one of the most critical things in the therapeutic relationship to happen is, if you want healing to happen, to be able to go into a provider in the healing arts and have an experience where, if it is the compassionate listening that happens, if it is a therapeutic touch, if it is the provider sharing a perspective on your story that resonates deeply with you, that precipitates clear intention and inspiration and belief about the ability to heal, that what we're trying to say here today is that that can be profoundly important to the catalyzing of healing, and that the person's experience in, we'll just say, a session or the immersion of the environment of the healing, session, usually with another person, although it wouldn't technically have to be another person, it could be some other thing too. But that experience of what happens humanly to align coherence to, on a top-down level, shift the mind into a space of stimulating that top-down healing, that's super critical. And I think that, unfortunately, again, I hate to bend back to the conventional healthcare system, but it's like, it's so relevant to most people who view this, how they've actually perceived and experienced healthcare in this lifetime, which isn't traditional healing as we had, 150 years ago, and then for thousands of years before. What you're experiencing typically is a very rushed, kind of, almost like sterile, emotional process that isn't, this syncing up and harmonizing of, like, relationship in the therapeutic setting. It's a, let's do some tests, let's, like, almost computer-like assess symptoms, and let's prescribe a physical substance, and then not explain it and not create the mind top-down coherence to establish healing beyond just saying, oh, take this pill, it will heal you, which we've already found out is pretty powerful. But what if you can take the power of all of those other steps that are more thoughtful in the healing, in a medical or health visit, and contribute that to how healing coherence arises, basically.
Mhm.
So in a way, we were joking as we were preparing for this talk. It's like, yeah, are we gonna kind of say, like, give people a disclaimer to not come see us because, the power of healing is basically in your mind in a huge way? It's like, well, no, because building to that place of coherence, that interface with someone you resonate as another human being, to say, I'm placing my trust, or how their hands are on you healing, like in the case of acupuncture, or body work, cranial sacral therapy, or Reiki. I can go on and on about 50 modalities. Or in my practice, that there's a major, almost like, counseling orientation to how a lot of my understanding the mind part of someone's being, spirit, soul, emotion goes, where the witnessing of someone's journey of life, and then the actual, like, perspective built upon that in the session, how powerful that top-down action is, and invaluable really that can be to a person to have that experience. So I wanted to kind of bring that forward into this placebo conversation,
Yeah.
because
Well,
yeah.
The example I have is, I had a patient one time, she was pregnant, she was having a lot of hip and pelvic pain, but of course I'm not going to needle right where the baby is, under the skin. So I did a treatment with her. She came back maybe a week or two later, and she was like, after that treatment, my pelvic pain was a lot better, even though you didn't needle there. She goes, was that the placebo effect?
Yeah.
And I laughed because I was like, well, I mean, depends how you define the placebo effect. I'm like, yeah, I mean, that's your body's ability to heal itself. I don't have to necessarily work on the spot that's causing your issue for that to be part of the effect of your body being in greater harmony and coherence and being able to manage that. I mean, even with drug trials, I hear the placebo effect for fake pain pills is quite high. People feel a lot less pain. And it's like, yeah, pain is not entirely, but partially perceptual. I mean, so even just something that simple, there's a big mental component in there. And our bodies are incredibly resilient. You know, there can be these chronic inflammatory degenerative processes, and they can sometimes be at least halted, if not reversed. And, you know, sure, there has to be some basics in terms of nutrition and physical activity often as a baseline, not 100% of the time. Sometimes those aren't necessarily the crux, but someone changes the way that they engage with their life and their and finds a purpose and more meaning that drives them forward, and it's amazing what people will heal from. And people who don't have that, like when you told that story about your patient who said, I don't want to heal, it makes me wonder if he or she went home and had to think about that, because they probably hadn't thought of that yet. You
Yeah.
brought that out of them.
Right.
And so now they have to confront the fact that they didn't
Yeah.
want to heal. And that on its own could have led to a transformation,
For sure.
because
Yeah.
now that they've confronted that fact that they were in their way of their own healing, they have to then go, well, why am I in the way of my own healing?
Yeah, that's their homework to decide
Yeah.
if they want to confront that.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's why, you know, whether it's a therapist or a counselor,
Yeah.
or a provider like us, having someone, because I do some similar things. Different people talk different amounts in my acupuncture sessions, but oftentimes, you know, certain things will come up because there'll be some emotional charge or life experience that is related to what's going on with their health. And, you know, I'm not going to tell them how to solve that, but I think being able to witness it and asking some good questions can help people think about it in a new way. And sometimes that's enough, you know, to move the process forward.
Yeah, totally. And it is, you know, I'll just go a little further with this part of the conversation, since we're talking about the power of belief and mind and all these different terms we're using today. It is really fascinating that, you know, if you take the time to be with someone and really try to learn deeply about their orientation to their life, that, you know, you can ask about their diet and their physical symptoms and their sleep and their exercise and all these things, and like hear about their habits. Those are like very physical plane existences, and they're going to influence their health physically and otherwise. But what's way more fascinating to me personally, and kind of alludes to this thing that Dr. David's talking about, is, you know, what do people believe? What inspires them? What drives them? What hinders them? What strains them? What, and when I say strains them, I'm not talking about a physical, like my knee hurts. I'm talking about like, you know, I'll give my own self-example. You know, I'm a very hurried person. I'm working on that. Why am I hurried? Like, what is that about? And, you know, what am I believing that's precipitating me to be so hurried about how I go about things? And so when you, as Dr. David said, inquire about that with someone, you don't necessarily know the answer. I don't know the answer of why someone believes or is inspired or is strained in the way they are. I'm curious to learn, but that process of inviting contemplation and introspection sometimes does crack open an awareness of, oh my gosh, that him holding that space to ask me those really perceiving, penetrating questions about, you know, how I orient my existence, brought me up to like up against a belief system I have about how I operate in the world, and then took me further to say, is that working out for me to operate off that belief system? And if it's not working out, if it's not serving me, maybe an interesting question is, well, how did you get to that belief? That sometimes context can help us
Yeah.
really orient ourselves, also be gentler with ourselves. It's like, if you're such a hurried person and that's so not helpful in your life, well, why the hell are you being hurried? Stop being hurried. Well, sometimes then you need to have a bit of that backlog conversation of, oh, this is how you're raised, and these are some life events. And,
Yeah.
and that orientation can create some gentleness around the effort it makes to change a belief system and a pattern. But nevertheless, once you find out that you're living through a belief that isn't serving you, that's causing harm in your life, that's causing either mental, emotional stress that leads to physical stress, or interestingly, we talk about physical lifestyle changes as if the habits and patterns we have physically of how we care for ourselves are not driven by our mental, emotional, mind belief systems, which they totally are. Almost all the habits we develop physically are related to how we mentally, emotionally engage with the world. So even then, we could argue about physical plane prescriptions, but without having the context and the backdrop of what drives the habits to form in the first place, we're missing the core thing, the key causal element. And so I guess I'm getting really passionate about it. This is like kind of at the marrow of what I love in my medical practice, is to illuminate some of this underpinning of what drives a person. And, Dr. David has mentioned the words purpose and meaning. And those are very key terms within this as well. Those are more on that inspirational coherence level to like facilitate and build that. But I'm looking to the other side of the coin and what precipitates decoherence, in strain in the organism. Because if we can remove that strain, we also create coherence. We don't simply need to find meaningfulness, purposefulness, and live into that. We also need to, examine and shine a light on the ways that we're causing disharmony in the ways we think and feel and orient to our life circumstances. I'm glad we're coming to this because it's a super important point that I would say I do inspire and illuminate the importance of the pursuit of meaning and purposefulness and how people seek that out. But I probably more focus on these other facets of where we're really creating inefficiency in our being, strain, by how we operate in the world. And fascinating too, to like, we could get very, and I have to cut this off because it'll just go on, but you ask about where that comes from, that decoherence. And then we could, if we want to get way broad and diverse in perspectives, I mean, we can even argue that a lot of these patterns don't even come from this lifetime, or they're literally generationally imprinted, or they're societally imprinted, and all these different things. So to just change a way of being, I want to really tell the audience that in no way am I saying that we illuminate, like in a session, the role is to illuminate a limiting belief system, say how it's not serving you, and then you stop doing it. I think that it's an immense, breadth of a toolbox of the illumination of that and the person's desire on a top-down level to not live that way anymore. What I guess I am saying in the thread of this placebo dialogue is that something that in itself is powerful.
And then we're like, cells in the organism of our communities or, state or nation state. And the more of us that can be more self-aware and more consciously healing ourselves and those around us, it does have a carry-on effect in our larger communities. And so that's why I am hopeful, even though there's a lot of craziness in the world these days. I am hopeful that I see the 21st century as a grand awakening where people, the 20th century was when we all were not everyone, but the mainstream was closed off to spiritual and aspects of consciousness that are what really truly make us human. And as each one of us engages with that again, we're part of that growing shift that hopefully will make our whole world a healthier place.
That's right. Yeah, it's a good kind of wrap out, to our talk and on an inspirational, empowered note, speaking of the placebo effect, which
Yeah.
is a great way to end it. I would say one last thing that I feel like is a very tangible, practical invitation to the audience, if they really want to be working on this qualitative part of healing and health, is to recognize, I think it kind of infused in one of the last things I just said, which is the quality of self-reflection, introspection, self-awareness. An author I love, Eckhart Tolle, uses the term the watcher. This idea of being able to be aware and mindful of your thoughts and feelings, of their orientation, in enhancing and cultivating the capacity to do so, I think is ground zero for unleashing the healing power of the placebo effect.
Yeah.
Because if you are unconscious of your thoughts and feelings, of your orientation and outlook to your life, of how you're experiencing your life on this higher planed, we call it mind, spirit, state. If you don't have any connectivity or ability to observe and orient and pay attention to that, and then you don't have the ability to shift it, right? If you're totally disconnected from it, unconscious from it, unaware of it, then if you're dwelling into a place of fear, hostility, anger, and you're not aware that you're just completely enveloped in that, how can you make the choice that you no longer want to inhabit that decoherent, strained state and move to a state of inspiration or purpose or meaning or gratitude or happiness or compassion?
Yeah.
Right. And so that to me is like a really, really key capacity for us all to be cultivating. And arguably, there's very concrete ways to do so.
Yeah.
And we've talked about a few of them today, but it's kind of contradictory to how our society runs, which is this like do and stimulate with things grabbing your mind's attention. And our money, capitalistic driven society, the way that operates is we need to grab your attention because your attention means your money, kind of thing. And I don't want to boil it down to that, but that is kind of how we've shaped our society. And what that really makes very difficult is this cultivational space for quietude, to be mindful and aware of this inner experience of life.
And just on a note with emotions, I think if all emotions can be healthy, right?
Yeah.
So anger can be righteous indignation at something that's horrifying to you. It can have a good outlet. The problem with emotions happens when they get stored in the body because that process didn't have an outlet. So like grief, if someone's grieving someone they lost, it's normal to grieve for a period. But if that goes on for a really long time and takes over their life and starts to destroy their health, that's when we now have a pathology associated with an emotion that's taken over. And that's when it needs to be worked on. So I think it's interesting because emotions are strong. They overtake us, right? Sometimes, but it can be important to have that quietude where you can actually look into yourself and be like, what am I still holding on to?
Yeah.
Is this an emotion I want to continue bringing forward, or do I need to let it go or process that experience more fully?
And when we come to this idea, full circle to spirituality and faith, I mean, you're giving the perfect example of, the act of prayer around an inner disharmony. And for many people's faith, it is surrendering to a higher power, that emotional state of helplessness, of fear, of anger, that you're offering it, out to no longer reside in you through a spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And there's many versions that we don't have to pin that down to Christianity or Buddhism or anything. It's to name, that's literally this more scientific, cerebral conversation we've been having in the last moment. What a practice like that is precipitating.
Yes, surrender and faith have become ever more important to me as I get older. I understand them a lot more deeply because there are definitely things in life that overwhelm you. And
Yeah. So, so to kind of, end the note on the placebo effect lecture, because we both got to go and see
Yeah.
patients. You know, I guess I want to, for those who end up viewing this online, thank you for, kind of listening to our perspective. And, do know that we very much validate all people in the healing arts, including in the conventional field of medicine, and deeply appreciate the healing work that's done. And we want to offer out this like higher consciousness of what might be driving healing for you all to be able to tap into and inspire you on this global consciousness that Dr. David was saying, that hey, if we're all leaning toward this, it's going to collectively help each other. And I love having a talk where we can get this microphone to share that perspective.
Definitely.
Yeah, so thanks, Dr. David, and we'll see you all later.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Have a good afternoon.